You know, Enzo Ferrari was a pretty smart cookie. He knew how to work the system. He knew that Ferrari's success in racing and the sheer presence of the Ferrari name gave him power, gave him clout. He was a slick negotiator, and when he needed to, he was happy to use his position of power to manipulate the outcome that he wanted. I mean, he was able to sell his company, have someone else pay the bills, but he retained control. Now, after 1960, Ferrari had a boot in both the Formula One and sports car racing camps. But sports car racing was changing. Increasingly, production sports cars and GT racing were beginning to take precedence for the manufacturers. You see, for them, racing was a means to promote their products. And while prototype racing was a great way to achieve this, it was expensive and it required constant development and investment. But GT racing was altogether different. The cars didn't need to win outright. Class wins carried a lot of weight, but also GT cars often finished well up the order, even against the prototypes. And in fact, some World Sports Car Championship races catered only to GT cars. And better yet, these were street cars that anyone could buy and in which there was a buck to be made. And for the manufacturers, that also meant they didn't have to run their own factory squads. Instead, they could support independent teams who did a lot of the grunt work for them. Now, to be homologated for GT racing, the manufacturer had to produce 100 identical examples in a 12-month period. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, for most of these manufacturers, it was a pretty big deal. But the regs also allowed for subtle body modifications year on year, so the manufacturers didn't actually have to produce another 100 cars every time they made updates. And this was known as normal evolutions of type. Now, Ferrari launched their beautiful 250 GT short wheelbase in 1959, and it had no problems with swatting off what little opposition there was. But by 1961, that was all beginning to change. Aston Martin and Jaguar in particular were transitioning away from prototype sports car racing and into GT racing. The 1961 World Sports Car Championship featured just 5 races, and these included the Sebring 12 Hours, Targa Florio, Nürburgring 1000 km, Le Mans 24 Hours, and the 4 Hours of Pescara. And the Ferrari 250 GT short wheelbase won all except the Targa Florio. And in fact, the 250 GT short wheelbase finished 3rd outright at Le Mans, which is almost unheard of for a GT car. And in addition, the RAC TT at Goodwood had become increasingly important, and the 250 GT short wheelbase finished 1st and 2nd. But Enzo could see the writing on the wall. The 250 GT short wheelbase was aerodynamically a bit of a brick, and it was quite unstable at high speeds. The new Jaguar E-Type was aerodynamically way more slinky, and so it had the potential to be a much faster car. Ferrari needed to produce a replacement, but they didn't want to go through the process of building 100 more cars, so they got creative instead. And the car that they created was the 250 GTO. GTO is short for Gran Turismo Omologato, and Omologato translates to homologated, which is actually kind of ironic. Now, this right here is a copy of the Daytona Cobra Coupes book by Pete Brock, who was, of course, the designer of these cars. And it's a first edition copy. As you can see, it's been signed. I actually bought this book through Chater's Motoring Books in London, and I actually bought it by mistake. Phoned them up, as you used to do, had to do it back in the 1990s, phoned them up, and I asked for a copy of the Cobra Ferrari Wars book. They sent me this instead. Not complaining, turned out pretty well. Anyway, I just wanted to read out to you some of what Pete Brock says in the book about the Ferrari 250 GTO. Under Appendix J of the FIA's 1961 regulations, a car was considered a production car or homologated if 100 identical examples were to be produced in a 12-month period. The word identical was subject to interpretation, however, and slight variations to the production model were accepted as normal evolutions of type within the formal wording of the FIA regulations. Fortunately for us, that being Shelby American, the FIA had also made provisions in '61 that allowed for manufacturers to build variants of special bodies for the faster circuits. Appendix J, Schedule 254 of the FIA's Sporting Code was a change in the rules which allowed any modification to a production car's body if it was in the normal evolution of type. The original rules were presumably not written with entirely new bodies in mind, but slight changes in Ferrari bodywork over the previous seasons had been accepted by the FIA, so the door was opened in '62 for Ferrari's masterpiece, the 250 GTO. There has been much confusion over the question of the legality of the 250 GTO, of which only 36 examples were ever built. Ferrari has often been labelled a cheater because the required series of 100 cars was never completed, but the 250 GTO was technically legal because it was a variant of the 250 GT short wheelbase Berlinetta produced from 1960 through '62. Ferrari, in fact, built some 200 of these lovely cars, but realised in early '61 that their top speed was being limited by their blunt noses and tendency to lift at speeds over 150 miles an hour. Ferrari's racing department ran continuing and extensive tests on their cars and knew exactly what was required to go faster. The 250 GT Berlinetta, like the Cobra Roadster, had reached its aerodynamic barrier, and by '61 a new body was required to stay competitive. It was their practice to make subtle and ongoing changes in each model's basic shape to improve its performance. As time passed, changes were made. These were considered a normal evolutions of type. The confusion over the 250 GTO's legality arose over the method Ferrari chose to homologate his new car. Whether this was done to deliberately deceive the FIA or not is still open to question. Normally, photographs of any non-standard parts were required on the homologation papers to qualify an option, but the final body configuration for the GTO had not been determined, and no photographs were available in the fall of '61 when the factory submitted its documents for their 1962 GT entries. Since the Anteater, as the GTO prototype was called, was still under development in Maranello, Ferrari's documents were submitted with a photograph of the standard bodied short wheelbase 250 GT Berlinetta. On the following pages were the usual list of performance options with detailed technical descriptions and photographs of the special chassis components that would be used for the racing versions. Among the items listed in the fine print was an entire optional body. When this undocumented optional body was questioned, Ferrari's representatives explained that all previous body modifications to the Berlinetta in its prior years of production had been accepted without question under the normal evolutions of type wording, and that this new optional body was simply a more complete evolution. The members of the FIA's competition board, however, were not convinced with this line of reasoning. Prior to that point, the rule had covered subtle changes in body style to accommodate evolving technology. It was a rule written specifically to accommodate the small European specialist manufacturers like Ferrari, Maserati and Porsche. But this request for approval for a complete optional body was just too much. Ferrari wasn't even showing a photograph of the option. How could the FIA competition board approve something they had not seen? Every other part that was non-standard had the required photo. Ferrari argued that those items were mechanical components and did require photos, but that their previous body option requests had been accepted over the years without photographs. A legal precedent had, in fact, they argued, been set with all other body changes, and they had all the documented proof to back their position. And so basically, when the FIA rejected the 250 GTO, then Pete Brock goes on to say, basically Enzo lobbied the racetracks themselves, the racetracks then lobbied the FIA, and ultimately the 250 GTO was approved as a GT car. And so basically what Pete Brock is saying here is that the 250 GTO should never have been approved for racing, but approved it was, and in fact its approval prompted the creation of other optional body cars such as the low-drag Jaguar E-Type and the Aston Martin DP212 and 214. So what was the Ferrari 250 GTO? Well, it was a lot more than a slinky body that had been dropped on a 250 GT short wheelbase chassis. It had been designed largely by Giotto Bizzarini, but of course he left Ferrari in 1961 as part of the Great Walkout. The shape was designed to be both slippery, so it could achieve much higher speeds, but also it was designed to be stable at those high speeds. The nose was very low and sported vents to help cool the radiator. And in fact, the tiny nose dictated that the motor had to be moved both down and back within the chassis. And this dictated that it needed to have a dry sump. At the rear was the very first tail spoiler to be fitted to a Ferrari production car. And this aided rear downforce and stability. And as a package, the 250 GTO was just immense, and the results back this up. For 1962, the World Sports Car Championship was expanded to 9 rounds, and the 250 GTO won its class in all 9 of them. And this included placing second outright at Le Mans, which was just insane. And this continued into 1963. There were now 15 races, and the 250 GTO won 12 of them. Now, of course, the 250 GTO prompted another optional body GT car, the Daytona Cobra Coupe. And of course, the Cobra used the same regulation loophole exploited by Ferrari to ultimately take down Ferrari. The Cobra Roadster had been pretty successful on US racetracks throughout 1963, but Le Mans exposed its weakness on high-speed tracks. 2 Cobra Roadsters were entered at Le Mans in 1963, and they were fitted with hard-top lids to try and make them more aerodynamic. But despite having 4.9-litre V8s and more power, they lapped slower than the Jaguar E-Types, the Ferrari 250 GTOs, and the Aston Martin DP214s. And that's because the Cobra hit an aerodynamic wall at about 160 miles an hour. Its shape dictated it just couldn't go any faster. The fastest Cobra set a qualifying time of 4 minutes 12.4 seconds. The fastest Aston Martin set a time of exactly 4 minutes, so it was basically 12 seconds a lap faster. The fastest Ferrari set a time of 4 minutes 5.5, and the fastest Jag did a 4 minutes 6.9. And so it was in the summer of 1963 that Carroll Shelby asked Pete Brock if he could design a body for the Cobra Roadster that would give it a higher top-end speed. And what resulted was the Daytona Cobra Coupe. Now, the new Daytona Cobra Coupes debuted in 1964, and they were met with a Series 2 variant of the 250 GTO. The Series 2 cars featured a revised body with a special notchback roof. There were 7 in total, but only 3 were brand new cars. The other 4 were updated Series 1 cars. Now, interestingly, Brock designed the Daytona Cobra Coupes without a rear spoiler. But in round 4 of the 1964 World Sports Car Championship at Spa-Francorchamps, they suffered severe rear-end lift. So a little alloy spoiler was grafted onto the tail, which looked much like that of the 250 GTO. Now, ultimately, the Cobras became faster than the 250 GTOs, but the Ferraris built an early points buffer while the Cobras were still having the bugs ironed out. And with 3 races left, Ferrari was still leading, but the Cobras were gaining. However, one of those 3 races was held at Monza, and guess what? It was cancelled. And who do you suppose might have had the political clout to achieve that? And that left Shelby with just 2 races to overcome the Ferrari lead. And they never did catch up, and Ferrari won the championship again. But Shelby American had produced a car that was now genuinely faster than the 250 GTO. While Enzo tried to claim that the mid-engine 250 LM should be homologated as a GT car, this time the FIA weren't budging. So Shelby American came back even stronger in 1965, but Ferrari had withdrawn. And so while Shelby and Ford went on to win the championship, they didn't actually get to beat Ferrari in a head-to-head championship fight. And by now, Ford wanted Shelby to focus on the GT40 program anyway. And then for 1966, new regulations meant that the optional GT cars were no longer eligible. And with that ended the short but fascinating history of the wildest low-volume GT racing era. And yep, Pete Brock is right. The 250 GTO should probably have never been approved to race as a GT car. But if it hadn't, the 250 GTO would never exist, nor would the Aston Martin DP212 and 214, and the low-drag Jaguar E-Type, and, of course, the Daytona Cobra Coupe and its various offshoots. And right there you have a list of some of the greatest, most desirable, most valuable racing cars ever produced. So really it could be said that Enzo used his position of power to manipulate the result that he ultimately wanted purely for selfish reasons. But tell me, aren't you glad he did? Anyway folks, that's it for this little episode. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button and the subscribe button. Tap that little bell thingy so you get a notification when I post up a new vid. Anyway, till next time, catch you then. See ya.